Good evening, everyone, or afternoon or night, wherever you're joining us from. We hope you enjoyed the video earlier on the work that our psychologists do in corrections. Thank you for joining us today on this keynote presentation on day 2 of ACOP 2022. My name is Xiang Long. I'm a principal psychologist with the Singapore Prison Service, and I will be your facilitator for this keynote session, which is on offending and desistance. To our colleagues from Singapore and the region, we hope you managed to catch a nice little dinner break or tea break wherever you are. And to our friends joining us from other parts of the world, we're glad to have you here with us, and we hope you're excited for the lineup of our program that we have. Before we start, please take note of the following information and house rules. Firstly, we seek participants' cooperation not to record the sessions or reproduce the content without presenters' agreement. The organizers, however, will be recording the session for publicity and archival purposes. Nevertheless, for non-sensitive content, you are free to and encouraged to share your experiences and thoughts on our social media. And don't forget to hashtag ACOP 2022. Secondly, you'll be viewing this on the conference platform, and you are free to add in your comments in the chat function on your right. If you have questions that you want to ask our keynote speaker later, please type them in the Q&A panel instead. So the comments are for the chat function, whereas questions will be looked at in the Q&A functions. You can also upvote questions posed by others that you would like to have answered. For further information on how to navigate the conference platform, you may access the self-help guide that has been uploaded onto the platform. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties with the conference online platform, you may also reach out to our organizing team in the chat or contact one of the emails here as well. Now, since we're all coming back from a 2-hour break from the program, before we dive in to the keynote address, we have a little engagement activity that we would like to ask you to participate in. And the engagement activity is to get you to type in the chat, as you can see in the slides now, which one of these cats best represents how you are feeling right now, coming on to the platform. We will give some time for you to respond. But in the meantime, maybe for myself, let me just share how I'm feeling right now. I think the cat that best represents my feelings right now is cat 8. I'm feeling a little bit refreshed from the dinner break. Been looking at the program and following the program for quite a while. So feeling refreshed right now and really, really excited for the program tonight and for the keynote later, as well as for panel discussion later. So what about you? Which cat best represents how you are feeling right now? All right, we can see some responses coming in the chat right now. Some of you with 8 as well, 9. Some with 6, that's a very cute expression. I wonder why you're feeling that way. 2 is a very gleeful look. I like that look. 5, 3, 5, 7. Oh yeah, okay. For some of us, maybe it's in the evening, after dinner. Usually we're not used to being on a very alert mode at this time, but I do hope you can stay with us throughout our keynote as well as our panel discussion later. Thank you very much for your responses. I hope that little activity has helped energize and perk you up a little bit. Again, before we begin, just a gentle reminder to our colleagues and delegates on this session not to record or reproduce any content from the presentations that are screened here. And for non-sensitive content, you are free to and encouraged to share your experiences and thoughts on our social media. Delegates can also find the recordings of the conference presentations on this platform after the day's proceedings have ended. And now I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Our keynote speaker for today is Professor David Best, who is here live with us. Professor David is Professor of Addiction Recovery from Leeds Trinity University. He is a psychologist and criminologist who specializes in conducting research on recovery from substance use and desistance from offending. He has published in excess of 220 peer-reviewed journal articles and 7 single-authored or edited books, most recent one being Pathways to Desistance and Recovery, The Role of the Social Contagion and Hope. He leads research projects in the UK, Europe, the US, and New Zealand. His sharing is entitled Ink Spots and Ice Cream, a social and societal model of desistance and recovery, in which he will share on the role of social factors in desistance and his conceptual framework for measuring recovery capital and desistance capital, and using these to build positive pathways to change for our ex-offenders. His keynote presentation will be for about 30 minutes, and then we will move to the Q&A section, where we will take questions from the audience in the last 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the keynote. Again, we strongly encourage all attendees to post your questions or comments in the chat function or the Q&A tab. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor David Best, please. Professor David.
Many thanks, and thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be speaking at your conference. So I will start by telling you a little bit about my background, and then I'll go on to say a little bit about the unusual title for my presentation and where that comes from. So yes, I have a number of academic roles. I'm Professor of Addiction Recovery at Leeds Trinity University, and I'm very pleased that there is now such a title and such a post. I also have an honorary professorship at the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University, at the Eastern Health Clinical School at Monash University, and I am the president of the Recovery Outcomes Institute, which is based in Florida in the United States. However, most of my expertise and knowledge in this field comes from the 3,000 or so recovery stories I have collected over the course of the last 15 years or so, and that really is going to be the primary focus. I actually intend to do, too many academics don't give other people credit, and I intend to try and do this by showing you some photographs of people who have hugely influenced me, and to tell you a little bit about their work. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The person who's presented here is Professor Mike Slade, currently of the University of Nottingham in England. And Mike Slade has made a significant contribution to the recovery movement, but not in addictions, in mental health, where Mike's work has been phenomenally important in the development of recovery colleges, developing pathways to meaningful activities and positive hubs, but also for a systematic review that he was part of, led by one of his colleagues, Leamy, which attempted to identify the key principles of recovery. Next slide, please. And what they came up with was a remarkable acronym that I have since used in much of my work. So the acronym is CHIME, and CHIME stands for connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. And since I first came across this acronym, I have tested it. I'm going to suggest it's not quite in the right order, but that fundamentally, human recovery is predicated on and rests on human connection, positive human connection. And that human connection generates hope. And the way it generates hope suggests something about how this social contagion happens, because primarily it happens peer to peer, not professional to patient, but it's a primarily peer-driven process, where the connection leads to the belief that if they can do it, I can do it. And that belief generates hope. And what does hope do? What hope does is generate a sense of willingness to engage in activities to promote and drive the recovery journey. That then creates a virtuous circle of engagement in meaningful activity, which generates empowerment and generates a positive sense of identity. This is so important, and for me that there are two core pillars that apply in the mental health recovery space, the addictions recovery space, and in our understanding of desistance from crime. And that is fundamentally that the process is one that is intrinsically social and predicated upon processes of social learning and social control. But the second core, absolutely core pillar is the M. The connection isn't sufficient on its own. It has to lead to some form of meaningful activity that allows an excluded and disenfranchised person to develop that sense of positive identity, removal of stigma and exclusion, and a sense of empowerment. And empowerment here really meaning both esteem and efficacy. individual and collective efficacy. Next slide, please. And in the United Kingdom, we have now developed something called the Lived Experience Recovery Organisations. And we have used the CHIME acronym to develop standards for the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisations, where we are creating a model of attempting to improve the quality of delivery and the consistency of delivery by focusing on the CHIME acronym as the mechanism for developing quality standards. And this really is quite innovative. And what the aim of our organisation, the College of Lived Experience Recovery Organisation, was to do three things. One, we wanted to ensure that the innovations that go on in lived experience recovery organisations are adequately mapped and measured. Two, that there is an emerging evidence base. And three, to both raise the bottom and to continue raising the top by pushing for the idea that recovery is not something that happens without a framework of professionalism, even in peer-based organisations. Next slide, please. Now, I'm going to go on and say a little bit about some of my own underpinning research from over the course of the last 10, 15 years or so, because we'll be coming on to something that's critical. I deliberately haven't gone for a definition of recovery because I want to keep this much more fluid discussion. But I'm going to tell you about two studies that I think will give you some idea of what's going on. In 2009, 2010, we started collecting data from people in addiction recovery in both Birmingham in England and Glasgow in Scotland. And we call them the Goya studies. And I'll explain why shortly. And effectively what we tried to do was to characterize what the key things were that predicted better well-being in a recovery journey. And there were two fundamental features to this. One, the more time spent with other people in recovery, and two, the more time spent engaged in meaningful activities. And the second one was kind of surprising for us. But basically, if you took a list of the number of hours somebody spent engaged in childcare, community group involvement, volunteering, education, training, and employment, the more time people spent in meaningful activities, the better their recovery strength. The more time they spent with other people in recovery, the better the recovery strength. Why Goya? Well, Goya stands for, highly scientifically, get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. Next slide, please. And we were challenged when we published this, basically along the lines of saying, well, how do you know it's not the other way around, that people who have better well-being are then more capable of engaging in meaningful activity? So we did a follow-up study in 3 drug action team areas in England, where we basically looked at transitions in meaningful activities over the course of a year. So we looked at people engaged in 4 different levels of meaningful activity over the course of the year. They initiated, they maintained, they stopped, or they were engaged in no meaningful activity at either point. We used 3 measures: physical well-being, psychological well-being, and quality of life. And what we found was really, really clear. Where people started or maintained meaningful activities, they had significantly higher well-being. Where people stopped meaningful activities, their well-being and quality of life went down. People who consistently engaged in meaningful activities had higher quality of life, physical well-being, and psychological well-being than people who engaged in no time. Now, this is not a proof of causality, but it's pretty close to being one. The more you engage in meaningful activities, the better you will do. And this started me on a process of saying, right, we now understand some of the things that are not internal personality factors that allow us to understand that process of change. Next slide, please. No talk in recovery can take place without referring to this man. This is William White, who really has been the father both of the recovery activism movement and also its primary historian and researcher. And he has done more than anyone, I think, to champion and identify the causes of recovery. And I've been very fortunate to work with William White on a number of studies where we started the painful process of saying, how do we measure what somebody has in their recovery journey? Next slide, please. And the conceptual work in this area was derives back to Granfield and Cloud, who, although this paper is from 2008, started doing this work in 1999. And they defined recovery capital as the breadth and depth of internal and external resources that can be drawn upon to initiate and sustain recovery from alcohol and other drug problems. In the same year, William White, writing with one of those authors, William Cloud, argued, and crucially from a strengths-based perspective, which fits not only with desistance theory, but also with therapeutic jurisprudence and with restorative justice. Stable recovery is best predicted on the basis of strengths as it is on the basis of pathologies. And this is really important. This suggests that a model of strength building is potentially an incredibly important thing to think about. Now, when I started as a junior psychologist at the Maudsley in 1995, 96, what we did in essence was to measure people's problems and attempt to eradicate them. But what a recovery capital model does is switch the frame to a strength-based focus. Next slide, please. And I combined my data from the Birmingham and Glasgow studies with work done by a US researcher called Alexandra Lodi. And we started to come up with a kind of taxonomy of what recovery capital looked like. And here for us, it meant three things really. The ultimate aim was to build those internal personal resources, self-esteem, self-efficacy, coping, resilience, and communication skills. But to do that required engagement with external groups, not simply a therapy-driven or a medication-driven process. It was predicated on two other things: transitioning the social network from network supportive of drinking or drug use to network supportive of recovery, and the ability or capacity to engage community resources that were available to the individual. Now, we originally called this collective recovery capital. We've now changed that name to community recovery capital, but the principle is fundamentally the same. The aim is to access resources in the community and to support that process of change. And for us, this became a kind of framework that allowed us both to develop measures. And over the course of the last 10 years, I've developed three instruments. The first was called the Recovery Group Participation Scale with William White and with a European statistician called Teodora Groshkova. The same group of three of us developed the assessment of recovery capital. And more recently, I've been involved in the development of the RECCAP. And the data I will provide you with is really now about RECCAP. So if we can go to the next slide, please. This is HMP Home House, which is an adult male prison in the northeast of England, but was also the UK's first recovery prison. This was the first prison in which the generic principles of recovery were attempted, and where we started trying to go to a strengths-based model of building recovery in a prison-based setting. And we used the RECCAP as a method of allowing us to count what strengths people had and how they changed over time. And what I'm now going to present you with in the next little group of slides is some data about what we showed with this. Next slide, please. What we showed was that the transition to a strength-based model meant that for people entering prison with drug and alcohol problems, where a strength-based model was applied, we saw marked reductions in unmet service needs and barriers to recovery, but not just a reduction in deficits, improvement in personal and social recovery capital, recovery group and engagement, and quality of life. Now, with prisons, we only had a relatively short window to do this, and it generally would be regarded that a culture change is much harder to do. What we also found, curiously enough, that as well as drug and alcohol workers in the prisons, peers were also able to administer and score the instrument and to provide us with excellent participation. And that peer-based model really is at the heart of the approach we have taken. So this slide and the work in prison has been undertaken firstly in the UK and secondly in New Zealand. Now switching to a different setting. The next study we have done has been looking at Fellowship Living, which is an organization of recovery housing in Florida in the United States. And we've started being able to look at both retention and recovery capital change as outcome measures. And what we found was that, I'll ignore the retention things, but I'll come back to that in a second. Greater recovery capital growth. So where people from their admission to 3 months subsequently show recovery capital growth, they also report higher rates of employment, higher rates of social support, crucially, greater recovery group involvement, better quality of life, and perhaps surprisingly, that they were typically younger in age. In other words, it was harder for the older population to show the same levels of growth. But what this allows us to do, and one of the big criticisms of recovery has always been that it's very vague and imprecise. Well, what we have here is a model that says that's not the case. That what we have is something, by switching from a generic recovery model to a specific recovery capital model, we turn things into measurable and metrics and allow us to change. So I'm now going to move, next slide, please, onto a different US state. So we move from Florida to Virginia. And what we find here is that we can start to say, all right, what do we do to understand not only who grows, but who disengages? And what we found was that there were a combination of both demographic factors and things to do with baseline recovery capital that predict retention. So what we're starting to do here is build up a clear science of recovery capital, where we look at the things that predict positive change, but we also look at the things that allow us to predict what happens to people that will encourage them to remain in this form of treatment. And recovery housing is a crucial part of the US system. Okay, so next slide, please. What this also allows us to do is to start tracking what typical trajectory of change we will get in recovery capital over time. And what we get, perhaps not surprisingly, is so each assessment is done at a roughly 90-day window. And what we get is a very steep growth in the first period of positive change in recovery capital, and then flatlining. But crucially, and admittedly, the numbers towards the right-hand side are relatively low in terms of individuals completing 8, 9, 10 or more assessments. What we have is the retention of gain. So we don't have short-term growth and well-being followed by a rapid drop-off. What we do, in fact, have is a fairly rapid growth in well-being followed by a stabilization phase. And I think this is fairly encouraging. And we would anticipate that with 4 of these assessments done each year, that this would allow change over time. No, that's fine. I'm happy to move on. Now, I did say I would say something about this slightly bizarre title of my talk. And this is crucially important because one of the other things that I think if you switch from a traditional treatment model to either a recovery or a desistance model is that we move from something that focuses exclusively on the individual. And in criminological theory, this would be very consistent with the work of Sampson and Lau on desistance and the role of collective efficacy. And in fact, I'll say something about collective efficacy as I go through. Excuse me. So, recovery is an intrinsically social process. What does that mean? Well, it means for the little person at the bottom of my ice cream cone, the benefits they derive in well-being come partly from social connection. They come partly from community engagement. We have 2 methods, social identity mapping and asset-based community development, depicted on here as SIM and ABCD respectively, that create those conditions for a drip down of the ice cream to build the capital of the individual. But, and crucially, that capital is not something that is unitary or individual. That each time that process happens, there is a growth of weak social ties. And that as that process happens, so there is a growth in the overall levels of community well-being. This is not a zero-sum game. There is every time there is a growth in individual recovery capital, there is also a growth in collective recovery capital, in community connection and community cohesion. And so we should not attempt to measure the outcomes purely at the level of the individual. Next slide, please. The model of recovery capital and justice capital or desistance capital would be exactly the same. also allows us to start to think about a taxonomy of not just strengths, but positive and negative capital factors, and also as a way of framing how something like stigma might be conceptualized in a recovery capital model. So the basic tripartite distinction is things that are personal, things that are social, and things that are the community level. And I just want to reiterate that point once again, that within this model, the idea is the social precedes the person. In other words, changes at an individual level are driven by things that happen at the community and the social level. Obviously, the relationships are dynamic and interactive, but fundamentally, this is a socially driven model and process. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I want to briefly talk about criminological theory here, because this very much reflects the work that was done first by Shad Maruna and Steve Farrell, and then more recently by Fergus McNeill. The idea here is that desistance, the process of giving up crime, goes through 3 stages. Primary, where the person stops offending; secondary, where they start developing new identities; and tertiary, where society will accept them back. And John Braithwaite has argued very convincingly, as far back as 1989, that we can have a society which is disintegrative, where people are excluded and never allowed back because of shaming, or reintegrative, where people are duly treated or punished, but are allowed to fully reintegrate. And it's important that we understand that that process has an impact on our, not only on our personal well-being, but on our collective efficacy. Every time there is an act of disintegrative shaming, a failure of tertiary desistance, we effectively reduce the collective efficacy in our communities. And for Sampson and Laub, and particularly for Robert Sampson's work in the last 20 years, it's the level of collective efficacy that is a strong predictor of low levels of crime in communities. Next slide, please. And so the next academic I want to talk about, who has been a huge influence in my career, is Professor John Braithwaite from the Australian National University. John, who was the author of the work on reintegrative shaming, has also done some incredible work around the idea of capital, and I would strongly recommend to anyone that they read his 2021 publication, Macrocriminology and Freedom, where he makes this point very clearly. Where we have financial capital, we spend it, we have less of it at the end of it, as we all know. Social capital, justice capital, restorative capital, recovery capital don't work that way. The more of that capital we use, the more of it there is. Next slide, please. And effectively what this means is, in this truly appalling diagram, is that Braithwaite's theory of crime reduction is effectively about intensive effective policing plus collective efficacy and a cascading motion. In other words, the reproduction of both ideas and the contagion of behaviors, leading to not only the ink spots, but also the ice cream with the added value and added components of effectiveness. And I've published a paper last year called Ink Spots and Ice Creams that drew parallels between John Braithwaite's work on collective efficacy and cascade ideas and my own work on ice cream cones and the notion of added value generating community well-being. Now, I didn't want to do this talk without talking about a big study that I have recently been involved in completing. Next slide, please, called the RECPath study. And the RECPath study was a European project comparing addiction recovery pathways in Scotland, England, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And there's some points I want to come back to from this study, which to me are hugely important. And I hope they are of relevance to you, and they should be of relevance to the justice system. So next slide, please. What we found was that in a study where we looked at pathways to recovery comparing men and women, that the average relapse rate was around 10%, not high. Per year, an annual relapse rate of 10%, slightly higher in men than in women, but Crucially, we categorized our sample into 3 groups. People who at baseline had less than a year of recovery time, people who had baseline who had between 1 and 5 years of recovery time, and people who at baseline had more than 5 years of recovery time. Well, 1.5% of people with more than 5 years of recovery time relapsed. This was the case for 17% of people with between 1 and 5 years, and 30% of people in the first year of their recovery. Recovery is a non-linear process, and the whole point of recovery journeys is to build that social and community capital around individuals in those early stages as scaffolding to sustain them through that initial process of change. Now, what we also found was that where individuals' recovery journeys included some form of peer-based recovery support services, in other words, where there was better potential for contagion, there was better functioning at our follow-up point. Higher levels of quality of life, higher levels of social functioning, lower levels of criminal justice involvement, and lower baseline levels of unmet need. So, for me, one of the absolutely critical things which the addictions field is slowly moving to, and the criminal justice field, in spite of its probation background, is still struggling with, is how do we get people effectively engaged in pro-social meaningful activities? Next slide, please. And one of the crucial things for me has been around what we call asset-based community development or asset-based community engagement, which are around those processes of attempting to engage people not only in the recovery community, which is the top left circle in the Venn diagram, not just with specialist professional services, but those things that fundamentally underpin both recovery and assistance: jobs, friends, and housing. And it's crucial if we are serious about having a model that's not simply about acute interventions, that we have to think about those longer-term reintegrative frameworks and models. Here, the assistance literature and the recovery literature are very much on the same page. We have to meet individual life needs and aspirations. We have to build hope and strengths, and we have to create personal interest. So, next slide, please. I'm going to quickly give you an example before my time is up of one particular study we did in Sheffield in the north of England, where we took a group of 21 people who were in long-term recovery, and we asked them to identify resources in each of those 4 domains: self-help mutual aid groups, recreation and sport, volunteering, education and employment, peer and recovery community groups. Next slide, please. And what they identified was a total of 134 available community assets. Now, all of our probation officers are overworked. They've all got too high caseloads. How do we address this? We can't address it simply because that work can't be replaced. But what we can do is to ensure that we use peers much more systematically and much more trustingly as bridge building to pro-social community resources, to give people that sense of connection and hope, and to create that sense that change is both possible and realistic and viable. And I'm going to cite another study that I was involved in back in the years when I worked in the modular. Next slide, please. We had a unit called the Acute Assessment Unit, which was for emergency admissions for heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. And basically, it was to address the problem that there was low client attendance at 12-step meetings: Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous. So we took 153 consecutive admissions to the ward, and we randomly assigned them to one of 3 conditions. We randomly assigned them to an information-only condition where they got a leaflet, or we assigned them to a doctor, the booking-in doctor actively encouraged them to attend, or we involved them in a peer support condition. The peer support condition was our assertive linkage condition. A peer would come, talk to them about the meetings, take them to a meeting, and then talk to them afterwards about what happened in the meeting. What we found was that only in the peer condition was there more meeting attendance on the ward, more meeting attendance in the 3 months after they had left the ward, and significantly reduced substance use. What are the implications of this study? Well, they are threefold. One, if you give people leaflets, it's the pointless abuse of dead trees. Two, booking in doctors are only marginally more useful than dead trees. The effectiveness of this model is predicated on human connection generating meaningful activities. So I'm aware that my time is now running out, so I'm going to just draw some overviews to this by saying, who needs community engagement? Well, among those people we see, there are two primary groups. One, those who are socially isolated and excluded, and two, those who do have social networks, but social networks that are harmful to their recovery. What steps do we need to take? We need to work out what those assets are that are out there. And in our work, that started by doing basic mapping exercises, but that is not enough on its own. We have to train and develop people to be the connectors. We have to educate and prepare our clients to engage effectively with resources. And we have to attempt to create in-reach and outreach models. One of the things that I think you probably weren't expecting today was someone to talk about community engagement rather than talking directly about change processes. And for me, this is crucial because for me, the challenge of successful recovery, long-term or successful recovery, is about effective community engagement, meaningful activity, a sense of purpose and a sense of citizenship. Next slide, please. So to conclude, what are the core concepts? Underpinning this all is the notion of CHIME: connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. Those are the fundamental principles of how you engage with people. To do what? To build recovery capital. And by building recovery capital, you don't just affect the recovery community. You affect a much broader community through processes of contagion and cascade. And the notion of recovery capital is effectively about generating that sense of both personal efficacy in isolated and vulnerable groups, but also collective efficacy. Collective efficacy in the sense of engaging effectively in processes of change. This is very similar to the desistance literature, and I have to pay particular tribute to the work of Shad Maruna in this area. And it's also important to say that fundamentally this is about transformation. Transformation of the recovery community, and I'm sorry I put in another acronym, recovery-oriented systems of care, but also the wider community. I'll stop at that point because I think we are just at the right time. So thank you very much for your time.
All right, thank you, Professor Best, for your very insightful sharing. Certainly, as a young psychologist, previously myself, I was very focused, like you rightly said, on trying to figure out what problems people are facing. And desistance certainly helped to provide me with a broader sense of perspective on what is required, and your sharings emphasis on their well-being and the need to enhance their well-being, social well-being, is of particular interest to me. We will move now straight into the question and answer segment. And we have actually a couple of questions coming in from the audience. First one is, firstly, a comment that is a brilliant sharing, and a question on whether you could share some examples of recovery resources in the community. What are these community connectors that you were referring to? Okay.
So let me start with the notion of how we trained people. So in our study, what we basically did was we took peers, and as a core part of their development as recovery coaches and recovery champions, we trained them both about developing alliances with people early in recovery, but also about building relationships with external groups and organizations, not just 12-step mutual aid groups, which would be their natural area to go to, but develop relationships with colleges, develop relationships with churches, and create those binds and trusts so that there were two-way movements, that effectively the groups felt that they were benefiting. They weren't just doing some act of charity. There were things in it for the NGOs and voluntary organizations. The connector skill was really to use their lived experience to guide and support the individual, but also to create credibility and to create trust in the organizations they were working with. And it's become a very important part of my training work, has been around the development and training of recovery leaders, part of whose role is community connector role.
All right. Thank you, Professor Best, for that response. Actually, this kind of nicely leads into the next question. You did mention different groups that you were training in terms of the work that you wanted them to do to connect with our ex-offenders. There's a question coming in here about how using that ice cream cone model of recovery, what do you think the criminal justice system can do to better organize these organizations? Because they typically are quite organic. How can we better organize and coordinate the kind of support they provide?
Okay, so I'll give you two examples from my work. So we have a recovery capital pilot currently going on with 2 drug courts in the United States, one in Rhode Island and one in Boston. And what we've been doing there is we've been training up graduates of the program to be effectively the recovery capital managers. So they are people who themselves have successfully gone through the program. And we have a twin benefit because we work on the helper principle. If I help you, you may benefit, but I'll definitely benefit. So it gives a kind of direction and career pathways to graduates from the program. But it also creates a credible source of information, support, and access to it. They act as the conduit to take people to the things that have worked for them and benefited them. That might include things like boxing classes, that might include like college courses in music or things that are of benefit to people. And the second example I'll give is from the UK, where we had a program called Jobs, Friends and Houses, which basically was about taking people who were in their last year or so of a prison sentence and getting them physically to build their own recovery community and their own recovery housing. And that model was about supporting change moving forward. So that was a very important part of that model of planning and preparing change.
Great. Well, it sounds like that's actually tertiary desistance in action.
Absolutely.
People who have
Absolutely.
recovered to do that sharing and help supporting for the other people who are trying to recover.
And as I'm sure you're aware, there's such a significant overlap in the problems that by helping people to attempt to recover from addiction problems, you frequently are helping them to try and desist from their crime problems because the two things are so intensely interwoven.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for that sharing. I think I'm just going to go on to a third question that just came in. The question is, what is asset-based community mapping? Is this a government-driven kind of effort, or is it?
No, absolutely not. No. This is very much the idea to generate engagement and partnerships between community stakeholders. So they will include organizations and companies that are based in an area, but crucially, it's third sector organizations, small voluntary groups, community activists, community champions. Bring them together to generate meaningful pathways to change. So they will create. So we did this with young offenders in an area of Melbourne called Dandenong. And what we did was we got 99 different community groups who were effectively offering their services and supports. And it wasn't statutory organizations, it was small community voluntary organizations. The courts brought them together, and this allowed us to effectively engage in that partnership approach.
I see. Professor, the questions are coming in fast and furious. I'm just going to pull out a couple of questions now to see if you could just kind of answer them together. As mentioned just now, there's no lack of organizations that want to provide help for these ex-offenders, and that's the case actually as well in Singapore. We have quite a number of organizations here willing to step in. But what are the kind of qualities needed for these organizations or these communities to best provide the kind of support our ex-offenders need?
And this is part of the role of the community connector, because what the community connector will do is help to both prepare the organization for working most effectively with our populations, but also prepare the population. And I learned this from my own bitter experience of sending people with personality disorders who were suspicious and anxious to community groups and causing all kinds of chaos. So we now have a process where both the group is prepared and the individuals are prepared and supported and monitored. And that's very much a peer role about effective matching. And as we get more and more people, and this is part of the collective efficacy process, as we get more and more people in, then we manage that process more and more effectively.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that the challenge for us, of course, is the pairing has to occur well. In the past, I think we've learned also that if we do not coordinate and match the support that they get, typically the support then kind of cuts off quite fast, and there's no common interest.
And this is really where I think it's very important to say it has to be reciprocal. The organizations themselves have to derive benefit from it. If it's done as an act of charity, as you rightly say, it'll be short-lived and people will get fed up and irritated by the process. If it's done effectively, so there's genuine sense of mutual gain and growth, and for the community benefiting, and frequently it has to have community benefit, then that's highly beneficial.
Yeah, that's right. I just wondering, I mean, we're talking about qualities of these organizations or communities. And you mentioned earlier that you did some kind of training for these groups as well.
Yeah.
What kind of training is provided, and what kind of skills do you equip them with?
We have a standard 6-week package, and we've also done it incidentally for community connector training. We've done for family members, for people coming out of category D prisons in the UK, to allow them to act as effective community connectors. So we train people up to identify community resources, build bridges, so that when offenders were coming out of category D open prisons, which is in the UK for people in the last 2 years of a long sentence, that they had bridges built. And incidentally, it worked perfectly from our point of view, because so many of the family members were also socially isolated, and they themselves benefited, which is that sense of collective efficacy and collective growth and weak social ties.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We typically focus on the individual and how to improve the individual's social network, but very often we also need to look at a different unit, and that's the family and how we can improve.
Yeah, and very much part of the transition from a treatment model to a recovery model is switching from the idea of the individual as the unit of analysis to thinking of the family or the group as the unit of analysis.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor Bess. I just
My
have
pleasure.
Perhaps time maybe for one or two more questions. One question, I think. The question is, the concept of capital seems to suggest that recovery capital can grow larger or diminish when not utilized. Is this the assumption? And if so, how much capital is sufficient? And if I can just add on to that.
The first question is much easier to answer than the second. Yes, absolutely. And the whole idea of the notion of capital is it's dynamic. So bad things happen to people, capital can go down. You know, if they become isolated, they lose resources, they lose friendship, it goes down. What is sufficient? We would regard a balance of personal, social, and community capital that's sufficiently positive that allows them to meet their goals without support. And the definition here of recovery would be self-determination at around the 5-year point, and largely the elimination of unmet needs and barriers to recovery. So I'm reluctant to give a definitive answer because it's subjective and personal, but we would say typically if people progress effectively in all 3 of the slices of pie that I showed earlier, then around 5-year time, people typically will have reached a sufficient threshold. They don't need external support.
Great, and I think that aligns actually with the literature and desistance, which also suggests that after 5 years, it's probably
5 to 7,
a stage of stable desistance. Well, I'm afraid Professor Bess, we have no more time for the questions that came in the audience. From the audience, there's really quite a lot of questions we didn't manage to address, but nonetheless, we thank you.
And if people want to contact me, I'd be happy to answer questions via email.
Sure, thanks for offering that. Thank you again for your time here. Well, we've unfortunately run out of time and come to the end of the keynote. To our audience here today, if you would just hang on for a few more minutes, we will take around a 10-minute break, and we will see you again at 9 p.m. Singapore time for the panel discussion. In the meantime, please enjoy the following video that has been prepared by the organizing committee, where we will share about the work that home team psychologists are involved in. We will start the panel session shortly. Thank you.